Hi guys, this is Bob with your weekly update of the state of the fuels and fire danger across our forecast area. The goal here is to provide a quick discussion of current conditions and anticipated trends to increase our fire weather situation awareness and improve consistency among forecasters when it comes to assessing if fuels are critical enough for the issuance of red flag warnings. Hopefully these discussions will introduce you to or refresh your knowledge of some of the tools that are available for assessing fuels and fire danger. Most of the images or charts used here can be found on our Google site under fire weather and then fuels and fire danger, or on the Northern Rockies Coordination Center Predictive Services page under fuels and fire danger. So let's begin with a quick view of the past conditions that led us to where we are now. Spring precipitation was near to well above average for most of the area, but not all, with the exception of areas along the northern border. Notably, Glacier, Hill, and Blaine counties do have a deficit when looking at the 90-day precipitation going back through mid-April. Since the beginning of July, precipitation has largely been below normal as we've entered a drier weather pattern, except for maybe far southeast portions of the forecast area, Gallatin, Madison, maybe far southern Marr County. Those areas have continued to receive moisture and are close to, or in some cases above average for the month so far. So this has led to an introduction of drought conditions across the far north. Again, mostly kind of the Glacier Park area, as well as Hill and Blaine counties, and over into Phillips County as well, just because of the little bit longer term dryness up there and the continued dryness as we go through July. So kind of putting all that together, where we're at in terms of fire danger, most of our area reached peak green up back in mid-June. The image on the left is called the growing season index, and as we progress, we're at pretty much peak conditions right now according to that, but as we progress into the coming weeks, you'll notice you'll see that percent growing seasons start to come down as our grasses begin to cure and dry out. Our fire danger observed, and this is as of Thursday, July 12th, is mostly in the moderate category, and to be expected with the wet June we had, and just not too far beyond our peak green up here. That moisture is still carrying over, and our fuels have stayed green enough, although they're changing now, that I would say the fuels are not receptive yet to fire, but they're becoming more receptive, and they're going to need a little bit more drying and curing to become critical. The NDVI, the Normalized Difference Vegetative Index, can be useful in seeing like kind of which areas dry out first, which areas are relatively more dry than others. These images compare the average of greenness observed by polar orbiting satellite imagery over the course of a week, so they're averaged together, and they're compared with past climatological data. So the relative greenness map is comparing the current week's imagery to the maximum greenness in climatology. So this week's map, showing a lot of very green conditions, is basically saying that we're still near our peak green for the year. As we progress throughout the coming month or two, we'll see those change pretty quickly as our greenness decreases, but that's always going to be compared to what the peak could be. The relative or departure from average greenness, the image on the right, is comparing this week to the same week climatologically. So we can see basically for where we are at this time of year, how it compares to where we would expect it to be this time of year. These images can get pretty noisy, and there's kind of several factors there. One is the presence of cloud cover. You know, these are satellite images, and they're based on polar orbiting passes. And where you see the white data on the imagery, there was just too many clouds, too many passes with cloud cover to get a good average. But even other passes that have some cloud cover, but it still generates an average, can make it kind of messy, and that's why you see kind of the jumpiness in the data there. The other thing, especially on the departure from average map, is there's a masking done to try and remove cropland because crops cure at different rates than grasses, and they won't be the same as a climatology. The crop could be different from one year to the next, and it definitely won't be the same as your natural grass would be. So they try to remove that, but the map itself isn't updated very frequently. So not only do you have the gray pixels where it's masked out cropland, but you also have a lot of pixels where cropland still gets through, and it shows like it's a lot drier because it's a cured out wheat field or something compared to the natural grass. So you kind of have to look at these, kind of unfocus as you look at these pictures and kind of see what more the general trends are across the area. And the bottom line is it's still pretty green, although we are starting to see some pockets of drier vegetation show up, and that's kind of more noticeable up around east of Glacier Park, and some pockets up in northern Blaine County, and as well as northwest of Fort Peck Lake, and that kind of jives pretty well with where the 90-day precip was kind of lacking in those areas. So percentiles, a lot of the fire danger indices, the fuel moisture stuff and the ERC, the best way to look at them is as a percentile to see where they are compared to normal or the extremes. So it's a real quick way to assess what our fire danger is across the area. Often the 90th percentile is kind of the number to watch, because that's used as a rough estimation of where fuels are becoming critical, because we're saying at that point that only 10% of all observations are worse than those values. The next is the 97th percentile, and that's because we're saying at that point only 3% of the observed database has had worse conditions. So we're looking at critical at 90% and extreme as you get to the 97th percentile. So ERC, the 100-hour fuels, and the 1,000-hour fuels are all still pretty much below the 90th percentile across the northern Rockies. A few places it's approaching the 80 to 90th percentile, but otherwise this indicates that our fire danger is not yet critical, but it's worth monitoring. The burning index, however, you'll see there is a lot of critical to extreme values in there, the 90th or better percentile. The burning index is influenced real heavily by the wind and humidity. So there's not as much fuel moisture or fuel information in there. There's a lot. It's driven a lot more by the wind speed and the low humidity. So on this particular day, it was warm and dry, and so that bumped the burning index up pretty high for that day. Energy release component, or ERC, is probably one of the most used fire danger or fuel type indices, and we're going to take a closer look here. And again, this information all comes from the Northern Rockies GAC page. They split their charts up into their predictive service areas, kind of like our zones. So this is their zone 13, which is they call it the Northern Plains and Missouri Breaks. One thing you'll notice right away is the observations are listed up there, what stations are included in this zone, and those are the stations that are averaged to get this ERC. All those stations are ROS stations. ROS stations have the fuel moisture observation sets on them, so we can record this stuff. But the thing to remember is all these ROS stations are pretty much placed and owned by the federal land management agencies. So we're talking Forest Service, BLM, Fish and Wildlife Service. So they're placed in the areas that are of interest to them. So in the Forest Service's case, most of them are on forest land, so the fuel is timber of some kind. Even these locations out on the plains are kind of mostly off in the Missouri Breaks. They're in coulees. They're kind of more meant to measure what is going on in the sagebrush type fuel, or maybe some pockets of timber that you have out in the breaks. So even though it's eastern Montana and it's the plains, it's maybe not the most representative of what's going on in our just regular grassland and croplands for that matter. So something to consider as you look at these. But we're not going to focus on the actual values. The value here anyway is more looking at the trends and where they're related to average and the extremes. So again, on this, the 90th and 97th percentile lines are plotted as the kind of the watch out points. But the other important line is the average, the gray line. And as we look at the current ERC, the blue line there, it's been tracking below normal because we've had such a wet June. But recently it has recovered up to about normal for this time of year. And then as we go ahead, we look at the average to see like kind of what we can expect in the coming months. And what you can see there is the average ERC kind of peaks out in August and stays pretty high through August, and then starts to come down in September. So we can typically expect our, a drying and warming trend to occur now, and to be kind of at the worst conditions through August, and then start to improve in September. So that's what we're looking at here. Our average our lower than normal ERCs, usually that minimum occurs, it looks like on this chart, somewhere in early June. So we did have kind of a delayed green up, or an extended green up period that lasted through most of June with those lower ERC values until they've recovered now. So putting all these different fire danger indices, fuel moisture, NDVI, all that stuff together, it still is pretty difficult to actually come up with an answer of where things are critical and where they're not. Good example of that, this is the fire danger rating from both the Canadian and the US. They're both on the same map, and you can see there's a huge disparity between Alberta and our border, with high fire danger, actually extreme in the red categories in southern Alberta, yet moderate for most of Montana. So this isn't easy, putting all these things together. One interesting thing about the Canadian fire danger system, from what I know, is they do have a little bit more input from the fine fuel moisture versus the larger fuels. So they're taking into account a little bit more of what the dead grass and pine needles and things would contribute. But they also have a higher input from the burning index, so it's going to vary a lot more, and on a hot and windy day, the fire danger is going to end up looking a lot higher than it would on our fire danger, which doesn't include so much of the wind in there. Anyway, the best information we can always get for our grasslands is the intel we hear on our restrictions calls, or by calling our actual partners and talking with them about the conditions they're seeing out on the ground. So we've heard this week on our restrictions calls, there's been some fire activity, not a lot, but there's been an uptick. A lot of farm equipment out there with haying operations underway. Choteau County, I believe, as well as Blaine County, had several fire starts. We also saw on Facebook, Marr County reported their first grassland fires, also from a swather. The thing to note about these is, while there's been an increase in activity, it's all been quickly handled. So we're seeing the increase in fire activity, but we're not quite critical yet. We're not having a bunch of fires start, and they're pretty easily being handled. The other thing, we've had a spot forecast for Woodhawk, which was a fire in the breaks in southern Blaine County. That was also handled pretty quickly. So overall, I'd say, with the fire activity is increasing, it's a good indication that our grass fuels are curing out. But I would say they're not quite critical yet. However, that's definitely the direction we're heading. And as we look up into the following week or so ahead, we'll definitely be getting more critical. So here's the outlook. We're going to talk about what we're expecting in the next week or so. And this is a GFS ensemble chart of 500 millibar heights and anomalies. And you can see pretty good indication of the western ridge kind of migrating a little bit further west to the interior western U.S. from a more eastern position that it was at earlier. Also, it amplifies some, and as we get towards the end of the period, as we get into next weekend and potentially into the following week, the end of the month, there might even be some phasing of the western U.S. ridge with a ridge in western Canada. All signs basically indicating, midsummer ridge, hot temperatures, and probably a pretty persistent period of hot temperatures, low afternoon humidity. Since this does look like a pretty persistent stagnant pattern, we'll probably get into several days in a row of poor overnight humidity recoveries. So in addition to the low elevation fuels already starting to dry, we'll start to see the high elevation fuels dry too. Exactly when they become critical is kind of hard to tell, but a good week of this kind of drying that looks to set up will probably get us close to critical conditions, I would think, by next weekend. It's something we'll definitely have to watch as we go ahead there. The images at the bottom there are just our departure from normal for 2-meter temperatures, of course, warmer than normal. But the precipitation through next week also, you'll notice there's pretty much a big hole over the northwest U.S. Kind of the northern periphery of that ridge is going to be pretty dry, with maybe some monsoon moisture creeping up into southern parts of our forecast area. But overall, it looks like a pretty hot and dry week or more as we head into that. So again, look for the transition to more fire activity and fuels becoming critical as we head through the following week. So just a kind of a summary here, some of the key points. Our fuels are past green up and they're beginning to cure. The northern tier of our forecast area, the Glacier Hill and Blaine County areas are somewhat drier, and their fuels are probably drying out a bit quicker than other areas. The upcoming week we'll probably see a good period of drying and an accelerated drying of the fuels. And so we'll have to keep a close eye on those indices as we go through the week to see when the fuels become critical. And it'll also be important to pay attention on those restrictions calls as to what observations or what people are observing on the ground in terms of fire activity and how hard it is for them to handle those fires. So that's pretty much all I had for this week's fire danger update. Just wanted to quickly mention as we go into the coming weeks, I'm going to go over some other tools. One that I want to talk about probably next week is the Enterprise Geospatial Portal, EGP. And it's something you can get to from the Northern Rockies GAC page. There's also a separate login. But it's a good tool for displaying fire activity, fire perimeters, new starts, as well as lightning data. So we'll talk more about that next week. And as we get into the more active part of our fire season, I want to also talk about our dispatch center web pages and some ways that we can assess their level of activity and how the weather may be impacting them by looking at their staffing levels and their preparedness levels. So we'll talk more about that next week, and we'll talk to you then.